Welcome to Questions and Answers from
Quarantine.
with Pastor Chris McMichael.
Hello there, welcome to Questions and Answers from Quarantine, episode 43. I'm Chris McMichael, coming to you from Tennessee. And we had a good church service today. We were able to operate at 50% capacity. Hopefully, wherever you're at, you're praying fervently that Pharaoh will let your people go and that this thing will turn around quicker. If one thing's for sure, if we don't pray, there's no telling how long it will stay in place. I've run out of things to say. Let's get on with the question. Question number 43. This one's kind of lengthy. We have to set it up. With Israel's tempting of God and believing the spies' slander against the land, that's the 10 spies who lied against the promised land as opposed to Joshua and Caleb who brought forth a good report. This question asks, if everyone over the age of 20 had to die off, who then taught the young generation faith? Who then taught the young generation faith? And I'm going to have to read into this question that I guess they are taking the presumption or the stance that Israel had to have faith to possess the promised land because we know it's by faith we possess the promises of God. But more than anything, let's look at it from a different angle. Let's take this thing and kind of adjust it and take a look at it. But let's first read from this in Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14, after the Israelites began to weep and wail and declare, well, would to God we died in the wilderness. Would to God we died in Egypt and not here. Why would God bring us this far to let us die in the promised land? God's ready to destroy Israel again. Moses intercedes again. God says, I will pardon according to your word, Moses, but as truly as I live, verse 21, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice, surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has another spirit with him, and hath followed me fully, him will I bring into the land whereunto he went, and his seed shall possess it. Let me jump down a little bit. He says, doubtless, verse 30, you shall not come into the land concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, which you said should be a prey, that is, we can't go in there, they'll kill our little ones. God says, your children, which you said would be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness, and you shall wander in the wilderness 40 years. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and shall bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. That is not a lot of encouraging word coming from the mouth of God. It's like the Lord, pardon the analogy, but the Lord's really wanting to be good to Israel. It's almost like it's Christmas Eve. And because they have pushed him this 10th time, if you'll go study from Exodus through Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, and in Numbers, you'll find there are 10 temptations wherewith Israel tempted God. By temptations, they didn't tempt him with sin, but by temptations, we mean they provoked him. Hebrews calls it the day of provocation or the season of provocation, where they kept provoking God with their doubt, their unbelief, their whining, their belly aching, their complaining, their questioning, their murmuring, their gossiping, and their slandering. Sometimes it was against Moses and Aaron they were murmuring. Sometimes it was against God. On a few instances, they would say, would to God we died in Egypt. Would to God we died back there where there was enough food and there was plenty of melons and grapes and pomegranates. And so what we see here is not so much a question of who's going to teach the young generation faith, but what God's dealing with is removing Egypt and the longing of the old world out of an old generation. It's been said many times, and it's worth repeating here. You can take... How can we say it? You can take the country girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. You can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. Or we could say it this way. You can take the Israelite out of Egypt, but you can't get Egypt out of the Israelite. when Israel had been in Egypt 400 years plus. It's going to be hard to remove that in a journey that began only a few months prior in Egypt. History tells us, and the rabbis tell us, they spent about a year at the mountain of God. And so I kind of see it as God understands he's dealing with the people who had lost track of their God. They didn't even know his name. He had to reveal his name to Moses so Moses could tell the people, who is it that sent you? Jehovah, Yahweh, I am. And so they have all the 10 plagues, and then they cross the Red Sea and they see the miraculous in the hand of God. And they see God supporting and demonstrating his power through Moses, and they learn to trust Moses. But as soon as they get to the other side of the Red Sea, they start complaining right off the bat. And then as soon as they get to Mount Horeb and they hear the 10 Commandments, man, they're violating God with the manna. They're violating God with not coming up on the mountain. There's just provocation after provocation. But even then, God was merciful, and he let them camp for a whole year at Leviticus. And I like to see this as, pardon me if you will, as detox. This is Egyptian detox. This is them getting to spend time away from their overlords, pagan worship. They get to stay at the mountain of God for a year, being taught the law of Moses, being taught the new culture there to adapt. And then from there, they moved on to go close to the promised land to spy it out. But even a year of detox was not enough to get them to trust their God, which is unfortunate. So the real question is, it's not who's going to teach the young people faith, but the real question is, or as we see here, what does it take to get Egypt and old flavors out of people? All they had to do is just trust and obey. All they had to do is just trust and move on. But they seemed to people more eager to believe evil. They seemed to people more eager to believe where they came from. They seemed to be an inconsolable people who didn't really understand where they had come from or where they were going. They were walking out a revival that they had sought God for 400 years. And yet in the midst of the revival, they failed to see that God was trying to revive them. And from there, we might take a little side tangent and say, when we as a people of God believe God for a revival, will we actually acknowledge it when it comes upon us? When Christ came into the earth for 3.5 years of ministry, he was the answer to their prayers. He was revival, and yet the people who sought him did not recognize him. And what might this next revival look like when God sends one? We're crying out for it, but will we receive it? And if we cry out for it and God sends it, will we allow it to do for us what it was intended to do, which was always pull the world out of us, get Egyptian thinking out of us, get Egyptian culture out of us? Or will we be like Israel, that is very resistant to change and very resistant to God's Spirit and his miraculous and his divine and his hand of provision? So who taught the young generation faith? Well, for the next 40 years, they still had the law read to them on a regular basis. They still saw a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. They still saw manna. They still saw the glory of God come down upon Moses and Aaron. They still saw Joshua serve. They got to be inundated in this. They didn't just get a 1-year detox. They got a 40-year detox. So by the time they get ready to go into the promised land, Joshua and Caleb aside, the oldest people are 60. And you have a whole generation that was just born in the wilderness knowing nothing but Shekinah glory. Fire by night, cloud by day, the miraculous, the divine. And that even proved to be a problem when they crossed into the promised land, because you have a whole generation that's now 40 years and younger who all they've known is the wilderness, and now you want them to adjust and go be a people dwelling in lands, a people farming pastures, a people farming vintners and vines and pomegranates, people who go from walking in circles to fighting city after city. No, I guess the bigger picture is no matter where you're at in time and no matter what God's called you to do, it's not going to be the same thing from 20 years ago. So God's always going to be communicating faith. He's always going to be teaching his people to believe him. He's always going to be promising blessing. He's also going to be simultaneously judging rebellion. And this process never ends. There's always old, dead weight dying off and young, fresh blood, young, fresh growth springing up in its place. And this process never ends. It also lets you know you can, or you do, you and I both have an expiration date. And we are only good to God for so long. then it's our time to go home. And if we ever become a hindrance to what God wants to do, he will just pluck us out of the way and his new growth will burst forth on the scene. So who taught this young generation faith? It's going to be Moses and Aaron, declaring the word generation after generation. All this young generation would hear the stories, even if they're born 20 years into the wilderness, they're hearing stories that all the old folks who mock God are dying. And those kids are going to grow up going, we don't mock God because we don't want to die. And they're going to hear stories. We have promises that we're supposed to go into that land over there. We keep circling it. And every year we come by and see the border of it. And then we have to go back into the wilderness of Zin. They're going to hear those stories and their heart's going to begin to say, that's our promised land. That's our promised land. We want to go into it. And so what they're going to have to do is begin to say in their heart, let us go on and conquer. So just through culture, the culture of Moses and Aaron, the culture of the law, the culture of fire by night, cloud by day, the culture of watching the deadbeats die out, I'm pretty sure, pretty confident, that taught them faith. That taught them to go in and trust nothing but glory and provision in the divine hand of God. I want to say, though, that the critical thing to see here is not who taught them faith, but why did God have to let a whole generation die off? And the answer to that is they refused to let go of old flavor. They refused to let go of old culture. They refused to let go of the slavery and the bondage that they had been freed from. They were brought out of bondage, but they remained bound in their heart. And what you and I have to learn from this as a giant allegory is, let us always be swift to move into the thing God's doing. Let us always be willing, like a bird or a snake or an insect, to molt off our old skin and take on the new thing God has for us. Let us not be allergic to change. Let us not be resistant to the new wine, as the Bible says in the New Testament. Let us always adapt and move forward with God. Dr. Sumrall said years ago in a book, he said, this is testifying, it was a book he wrote near the end of his life. He said, I can say that I have been a part of 5 revivals, and I have found myself at the cutting edge of many of those. And he said, all I can say now is, God, whatever you do next, let me be on the tip of the spear. Let me be on the cutting edge of it. And whatever you do, Lord, in the earth, don't pass me up. Let me be a part of what you're doing. And that's what our heart's got to be. Whatever God is doing, may we be a part of it. And may we be willing to lay aside any weight, any sin, any old habit, any old way of thinking, anything that would hinder us from going forward with God. Let us lay it aside, lest God lay us aside and find our replacement. I think that's a sufficient answer. I hope that helps you. More than anything, I really pray that it challenges you to draw closer to God and to seek him and to want to be a part of what he's doing. Please continue to pray for our nation. Call our country free. Call the true numbers out. We're praying that the real statistics, the real numbers come forward, that naysayers or disagreeable voices are not suppressed in the media or on social media. We're praying that these naysayers, these scientists and doctors who are beginning to say these numbers aren't adding up, we're praying that their voice can be heard and there comes a greater reckoning of true numbers and true math and true science, because there's a lot of stuff out there that's starting to taste real shady. If you're listening to this, you're probably like, yeah, but we're just not permitted to say yeah. And there's a problem when in our nation, we are not permitted to disagree and we're shouted down. There's a real problem with that. We'll see you in the next episode. That'll be episode number 44. Don't know what the question is yet, but I bet it'll be good. And we'll see what we can do to answer it. Love you all. We'll see you next time.